the air in Odd. West Virginia hangs heavy, still, almost watchful. Down a dirt road that twists away from the world, a small weather-beaten house crouches beneath sagging trees. Its yard is scattered with rusting tools, broken furniture, and the soft movement of stray dogs weaving between the shadows. On the front porch sits a man in his late 60s, his gaze fixed on something far away. His eyes dart sharply when strangers approach, his lips part, and instead of words, a deep, guttural grunt escapes. A sound that's almost human, almost animal. This is Ray Whittaker. For decades, his life has been confined to this patch of earth, surrounded by the same family who raised him, who share more than just his last name. Every feature of his face, every thread of his health, even the way his mind works, was set long before he took his first breath. Not by fate, not by chance, but by a family history so tangled, so compressed, that its genetic weight has crushed generations before him. It is a story most people would expect to find in the annals of ancient royalty, kings and queens marrying within their own bloodlines to protect power. But here, in rural America, it unfolded in silence, far from the marble halls of history. And Ray Whittaker, a man who cannot speak, became one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding ever recorded in the United States. His life is a living record of what happens when a family tree stops branching and begins to circle in on itself. Long before Ray Whittaker was born, before his parents had even met, the seeds of his fate were sown in the hills of Appalachia. In the late 1800s, two identical twin brothers, Henry and John Whittaker, settled in a small, isolated pocket of West Virginia. Theirs was a life of hard soil and harder winters, where neighbors were few and families relied on each other for survival. Identical in appearance and in DNA, Henry and John were nature's mirror image, sharing nearly every gene between them. That genetic sameness was not a problem until their children grew up together. One son from Henry's household fell in love with a daughter from John's. They were first cousins, but they carried something far more potent than ordinary cousinhood. The exact same paternal DNA coursed through both of them. When they married, the genetic differences between their bloodlines shrank dramatically, collapsing the diversity that nature depends on to keep offspring healthy. Their children inherited not two varied family histories, but nearly identical ones. And in a place as remote as Odd, where the dirt roads often ended in someone's front yard, choices for marriage partners were slim. Over time, cousin married cousin again, not because of malice or some secret agenda, but because life's geography penned them into a small circle of familiarity. What began as the union of two closely linked cousins was about to become a repeating cycle, each generation folding back in on the last. It was here, in this quiet Appalachian valley, that the Whittaker family tree began to twist inward. Each marriage tightened the genetic knot. Each birth carried a little less variation than the one before. And in the span of a few short generations, the Whittakers had set themselves on a path toward one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding in American history, though no one in those early years could have imagined just how far it would go. As the years passed, the Whittaker family's world remained small. Roads out of Odd were long and winding, and few outsiders ever came in. In this seclusion, kinship became the default connection, and marriage often meant choosing from within the same small circle of faces you'd known since childhood. From the union of the first cousins descended from the identical twins, another pairing emerged, John Whittaker and Ada Whittaker. They were first cousins themselves, bound by blood on both sides of their family. In any other community, a marriage like this might have been rare, even whispered about. Here, it was simply accepted. By now, the family's ancestry had already begun to fold in on itself, with each marriage further shrinking the pool of genetic variety. Their daughter, Gracie Irene Whittaker, was born into a family where the pattern had become more than coincidence. It had become tradition. Generations of Whittakers had married cousins, and by the time Gracie came of age, this tradition was deeply rooted, reinforced by the simple reality of isolation. People married who they knew, and who they knew were often their own blood. But in Gracie's story, the cycle would take an even sharper turn. Her eventual choice of husband would not just maintain this pattern, it would intensify it in a way that magnified the risks far beyond anything the family had yet seen. And it was in that decision that the fate of her children, including a boy named Ray, was sealed long before they were born. Gracie Irene Whittaker grew up with the hills closing in on all sides. In a world where family wasn't just part of your life, it was your entire world. By the time she reached adulthood, the choices for a partner were as narrow as the winding road that led out of Odd. In 1935, she married John Emery Whittaker. To most, it was just another cousin marriage, the kind that had happened quietly in these valleys for decades. But this union was different, far closer than the label first cousins suggests. Gracie's father and John Emery's father weren't just brothers. They were the sons of identical twin brothers. That meant Gracie and John shared far more DNA than any typical first cousin pair. Genetically, they were closer to half-siblings, their chromosomes carrying the same rare mutations passed down through mirrored bloodlines. This was not a one-off pairing, but the culmination of a lineage that had been spiraling inward for generations. Two sets of grandparents became one. Family lines that should have branched outward had instead looped back into themselves. When Gracie and John married, they were, in essence, reuniting two halves of the same code, giving any hidden genetic flaws the perfect chance to meet again. Together, they would have a staggering number of children, 14 in all, though some would not survive. Each birth carried the compounded risk of the family's genetic history. And among these children, one boy would become the living symbol of what happens when a bloodline is too tightly bound. Ray Whittaker. By the early 1950s, the Whittaker household was already overflowing. Children played barefoot in the yard, their clothes worn thin, their faces marked by the hardships of rural poverty. Some moved with awkward gaits, others spoke in fragmented words, or not at all. Into this world in 1953, Gracie gave birth to her son, Danny Ray Whittaker. From the moment he came into the world, Ray carried the full weight of his family's history in his veins. His DNA was a mirror of itself, countless genes duplicated from both parents, leaving little room for the variation that nature uses to mask harmful traits. He was the product of a lineage so condensed that his genetic similarity to his parents rivaled that of a child born to half-siblings. Ray was not the only child in the family to bear these burdens. Many of his brothers and sisters showed signs of developmental delays, physical deformities, or severe learning disabilities. Some would never attend school, never marry, never live on their own. In this house, disability was not an exception. It was the norm. For the Whittakers, these outcomes were accepted without question. There were no genetic counselors, no doctors explaining in scientific terms what inbreeding depression was. There was only life as they had always known it. Children born into a small world, shaped by the same intertwined roots, with fates written long before their first cries echoed through the hollow. As Ray grew, it became clear he would never walk the same path as other children. Words never formed in his mouth. Instead, he communicated through guttural grunts, sharp yelps, and low, throaty barks that startled those who heard them for the first time. His eyes had a way of locking onto someone suddenly, wide and searching, before darting away again. Approach him too quickly and he might bolt, sometimes running into the yard, sometimes tugging at his trousers in a nervous, confused reflex. These behaviors weren't deliberate choices. They were the outward signs of a mind shaped by profound cognitive impairment, the kind that runs deep in the blood when generations of the same bloodline fold back into itself. Physically, Ray was fragile. His frame stayed thin, his posture slightly hunched, his movements stiff, as if every step was an effort. Medical care was scarce, more often than not, non-existent. Years later, a visiting doctor would discover he'd lived with an untreated knee injury for who knows how long, simply because no one in the family had sought help. Whether from lack of money, lack of transportation, or lack of understanding, problems like these were left to linger. The house he lived in with his siblings was as much a cage as it was a shelter. Cracked boards let in the cold. Animals wandered in and out. Food was whatever could be found or given. And through it all, Ray remained in his own world. A world without words, without the noise of modern life, defined by the same dirt road and weather-beaten walls he'd known since birth. For outsiders, meeting Ray was like stepping into a different time, a place where the genetic and social isolation of the past still ruled the present. But to understand why he turned out this way, you have to go beyond the walls of that house and into the science hidden inside his DNA. Every human carries a collection of hidden genetic flaws, mutations that sit quietly in our DNA, masked by healthy copies from the other parent. In most marriages between unrelated people, the odds of both partners carrying the same rare defect are slim. But when close relatives have children, the genetic deck is stacked differently. Gracie and John's marriage wasn't just a first-cousin union. It was a genetic multiplier. Because their fathers were sons of identical twin brothers, the DNA they passed to their children was nearly identical. Instead of 4 sets of grandparents, Ray's genetic family tree collapsed to 2. The result was an unusually high inbreeding coefficient, a scientific measure showing how likely a child is to inherit 2 identical copies of a gene. In Ray's case, that coefficient was closer to what you might see in the child of half-siblings. When both copies of a harmful recessive gene meet in a child's DNA, there's no healthy version to compensate. That's when the gene's damaging effects appear, effects that can range from physical deformities to severe intellectual disability. In biology, this is called inbreeding depression. It's the same genetic pressure that crippled European royal lines and even ancient Egyptian dynasties. For Ray, it meant his DNA was like a closed loop, repeating the same instructions over and over until every flaw had nowhere left to hide. His mind, his body, his future, each was shaped before he ever took his first breath. In a family where cousin marriages had been the norm for generations, breaking the cycle seemed almost impossible. Isolation and tradition worked hand in hand, narrowing the pool of potential partners until kinship was less a choice and more a certainty.